subscribe.
They could scarcely read, write, or count, and they were hopeless with guns. Yet in the 1960s, Ronnie and Reggie Kray became Britain's most notorious gang bosses, feared and hated, respected and despised, adored and ridiculed. Some 60 years on, it's time to strip off the myth, fantasy and invention that has raised them almost to role model hero status and lay bare the grubby reality. This is the story of one man who saw Ronnie and Reggie Kray close up, nose to nose, almost incessantly for 3.5 years at their manic-depressive height or depth, according to your point of view. He was their strongest henchman and their senior collector of protection money throughout their final years, when they murdered 2 men, ordered a 3rd and planned other gangland executions. Despite the evidence of his own eyes, Donahue stood by them through to their final arrest. He broke away only when they told him to take the rap for a murder he had not committed. At this point, he turned Queen's evidence and helped send them both to prison for a minimum of 30 years. In view of his brutal initiation by gunshot into the firm, it strikes me as strange that they could ever have felt sure of his loyalty. Charlie Kray expressed the same view when he said, "I told Reggie once, if he joins the firm, Donahue will never forget it. He'll be an enemy. He'll work for you, but he'll always be an enemy." And Reggie said, "No, I don't think so. His all right is Donahue. He knows it was one of them things." Donahue is adamant that when he joined the firm in 1964, Charlie greeted him with the warmest of handshakes. He claims it wouldn't have seemed at all odd to Charlie that the twins' newest lieutenant had a hole in his plastered foot through their brutality, because ritual humiliation was their standard recruiting method. Indeed, it was their way of securing loyalty, and it had worked remarkably well since 1954, when they began their rapid and strangely irresistible rise in a profession in which London's East Enders had been ferociously competitive for generations. Albert Donahue joined the firm 10 years after Ronnie and Reggie first set themselves up as gangland bosses. Here is his story in his own words. By the early 60s, I was an active criminal on a good little team. Our main business was payroll snatches. We operated out of Bow, 2 miles east of Bethnal Green, the heart of Kray territory. We knew the Krays but had little to do with them. We were our own bosses. Around this time, I got to know a man named Lenny Hamilton. He was a sort of valet, a batman for Harry Abrahams, one of the guys on our payroll team. Lenny wasn't a robber, but on the weekends he used to look after this guy's kids while we went over to Paddington to mix with the working girls. Late one Sunday night, so late, it was Monday morning, we came home to find Lenny sitting there looking dreadful. Lenny had a dark complexion and black stubble, so we couldn't help noticing these fresh grooves in his face, which looked as if they'd been cut into his cheeks. His hair was badly burnt, and one of his eyes looked as if it had been almost poked out. We said, "What's happened, Lenny?" And he told us how somebody had sat him down, tied him to a chair and burnt his face with a cold steel, a poker-shaped tool you sharpen knives with. So we said, "Who was it? We'll go and see them." But he wouldn't tell us. Eventually, I got fed up trying to coax him into giving us the names, so I said, if somebody had done that to me, I wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. I'd go out and blow their head off. Later I found out that the man who'd used the poker on Lenny was Ronnie Kray. I knew Ronnie had a reputation for violence, but we weren't softies either. So me and Harry phoned the twins and went round to their house in Valence Road to find out what this branding was all about. We knew that Ronnie and Reggie liked to deliver symbolic messages, so what did they mean by doing this to Lenny? If this was a message, we wanted to know what. Were they signaling that they were going to war with our team or something? Just in case the war had already started, we decided to go tooled up, so I was carrying a shooter. When we got to the house, this gun nearly came out of my trousers. I'm fumbling about, trying to put it back so clumsily they could have thought I was making a deliberate signal. They must have known what was there, but nothing happened. They could see if they had made a move, somebody would have got shot. This was what we'd gone round there for, to have a shootout. They probably knew that, so Ronnie said, "Well, it's no good crying over spilt milk. What's happened has happened." Lenny got a bit flash, and that's the end of it. Just leave it. It was more or less a peace talk, and it was agreed that nothing else would be done. Within a couple of months of the Lenny Hamilton incident, I got nicked for a failed payroll snatch. I got a 3-year sentence, but in those days there was no parole. You did the straight 2 years, and, if you were good, you got 1 year's remission. Now while I was away, someone who was close to Lenny has gone and told the Kray twins that I'd said if they'd done that to me, I'd have blown their heads off. But at the moment when I'd said that, I didn't realize that it was the twins who'd done Lenny because he had refused to tell me. So, unknown to me, all the time I was away, they must have been thinking I was still planning to gun them down. Mind you, if I had known right from the start that it was them too, I would have still thought the same, but I wouldn't have said so. So when I come home after my 2 years, I know nothing of what the twins have been told. Then I hear they're looking for me, but I have no reason to suspect anything. I'm also a bit skint, so just like any East End con fresh out of jail at that time, I go round to the twins' local pub, the Crown and Anchor, because it was known that if you were short of money, you would go and get a few quid off them. So I walk in the Crown, go up to the bar, and within 10 minutes people are drifting away from me. Now I know something is going to happen. Next thing, I get shot in the back of the leg by Reggie Kray. Of course, I have to go to hospital because the bullet stayed in. If it goes straight through you, it's probably alright. Then I get out of the hospital. I'm in plaster, and I'm sitting in a little drinking club in Mile End, and this guy Bill Ackerman comes in. He's a bit of a gopher for the Krays, and he says, "The firm's looking for you." He mentions a few faces, Big Tommy Brown, Johnny Squibb, and says, "They're all looking for you." I say, "What for?" He says, "The twins want to see you. So they've been sending these delivery boys to collect me." And so I tell Bill, "Well, they know where I live. I got my leg in plaster. I can't run, but I might as well go round their house. Will you take me round there?" Now Ackerman is so scared he nearly has to change his underpants, but to me, this was common sense. So he drops me at their house and scuttles off while I knock on the door. Reggie shows me into the front room, and I find myself sitting with all 3 Krays, Reggie, Ronnie, and Charlie. They say, "How do you feel apart from the pain?" I say as a peacemaking gesture, "Well, if I'd have been in your position and someone had told me the nonsense you'd heard over Hamilton, I'd have probably done the same as you." So they say, "Okay, what we do is we put you on a pension," that was their word for wages, "and, when you're fit, come and get your money with us." So that's it. Now I'm on the firm. It was all smiles, and Charlie shook hands with me. For me, I could see a lot of benefits ahead: money, high status in the underworld, and far less risk of getting nicked. I knew that much of the twins' money came from protection, which, in some circumstances, is scarcely crime at all. Otherwise, I really didn't know how they made their bread. I only found that out later. I could see why the twins wanted me on board, but how could they be sure of my loyalty? Reggie had only just shot me, and most people, bent as well as straight, would think that shooting someone is a crazy way to recruit him to your gang. What's to stop that person biding his time and doing the same to you, or betraying you someday to the police? Such thoughts never seemed to cross the twins' minds. Strange as it seems, this was their normal method of initiation. I know half a dozen people who were recruited in a similar way, including my brother-in-law Bill. The same thing happened to him, only worse. He was cut to pieces and nearly lost an eye. There was Lenny Hamilton himself. Despite his branding, even he signed on with the twins. 9 times out of 10, people on the real, inner firm, not fringe folk like the Lambriana brothers, had first had a ruck with the twins. They'd come unstuck but had stood up to the punishment. Only then were they made full members of the firm. Any logical reading of human nature will tell you that, in the long run, this is a mad way to hire thugs. But, of course, the twins were mad. And, in some respects, there was method in their madness. Most of the time they were looking for good all-round hoodlums, not weak-willed hangers-on. When they were on a recruitment drive, the first thing they wanted to know was, were you good with your fists? If you could fight, this was a good sign that you might be some use to their criminal organization. They'd also go for people with a reputation in one of the local manors. You could be from Hackney, Bethnal Green, Poplar, Bow, or wherever, but once the twins knew you were the main man, if it suited them, they would take you to pieces in your local pub or club to see how you reacted. If they heard you wanted to call the police, they would not even try to recruit you. You'd just be done over a few more times until you were no threat. Once you were done, you were theirs for life. That was their idea. Like breaking in a horse, the beating or shooting was their way of giving a message. Then you had the choice, go to the police, or do something about it, come at them. But if you chose to do neither, okay, that's it. Forget it. End of. They're thinking, you hadn't gone to the police despite a serious injury, and you haven't tried to shoot their heads off, so you must be a staunch fellow. When my leg was out of plaster, and I had fully recovered, I took my place among the chaps. I soon got to know the firm's exact strength. At the top, of course, were the three Krays. There was the twins' older brother, Charlie, who was more on the business side. He had a good appearance, and he could talk. He wasn't spivvy, and he had a bit of charm, so he would meet respectable types. He could handle all that side. When he was among us EastEnders, at the day club in the Regency, he had a bit of a gangster's swagger, but when he was sent to meet half-straight business types in West End hotels, then he would put on his educated style. I think he was a lot brighter than the twins. He took little part in the day-to-day running of the firm, but he knew what was going on. Then there were the twins. Reggie was 5'9", well-built but slighter than Ronnie, who was 2 stone heavier and carried himself to suit the weight. Reggie was more agile, fit, and athletic. He'd march with you, and when we'd go for a breath of fresh air in Victoria Park, he would break into a boxer's training run and start sparring. Ronnie used to amble along, but if he had to step out and get a move on, he would strut. He was bordering on fat and was getting a bit soft and jowly, whereas Reggie remained tight and hard throughout my time with them. On the firm I soon became known as Reggie's man, Big Albert. Whenever he wanted a henchman, bodyguard, or just company, I'd go with him. Then there was Scotch Ian Barry. He was known as Ronnie's man. Then both Ian and I were partnered off again. My partner was Ronnie Hart, a distant cousin of the twins. Ian's partner was Scotch Jack Dixon. Then we had a few loose muscle guys like Ronnie Bender and Big Tommy Brown. If we had to put on a show of strength, go in plenty-handed, these were some of the people we could call on, but they weren't actually members of the firm. We were all thugs with scarcely any education, and only some of us had any common sense. Consequently, there had to be an executive side to the organization, consisting of little Tommy Cowley and above all a very bright, educated and funny man called Leslie Payne who, to my regret, fell out of favor at the court of the twins not long after I joined. The firm was run a bit like a conventional business. Every morning at 9 o'clock we used to have a meeting at Valence Road to discuss what we were going to do for the rest of the day, who to visit, who to use, who to take, who was going to drive. And then we would pick up all these friends and put them to work. At the meeting we would also discuss any information we'd got from the night before. This was where the twins got a hefty return on all the little payoffs they had made to people when they were in jail or when they came out. Just as I had told Ronnie I had come to the Crown and Anchor to get a few quid off them, most of London's professional criminals knew that, whoever you were, you could come straight out of the nick, and the twins would help you with a small casher. This wasn't charity. All these guys were required to pay the money back in kind, with information. The twins would just say to each one, "Where are you?" And the guy would say, "I'm in Paddington," or "I'm in Fulham," or wherever. So they would say, "Well, if you hear anything in Paddington, let us know." For Ronnie and Reggie, the return on all these handouts over the years was a vast network of informers. Anywhere in London, anything that went off, we knew more or less within an hour who was involved, how much they'd got and where they lived. Everything. So at the morning meeting the discussion might start with the other two saying, "We heard that so-and-so went off last night. It's a little team out of Hackney. It's got about that they're selling the stuff today, and they're going to get 5 or 6 grand for their whack. Running this team is Charlie Brown. Now this Charlie owes us a favor, so pop round and see him. Tell him to come and see us, or get a bit of dough off him." So we'd ask the twins, "What sort of dough you talking?" And they would say they'd want a monkey, £500 or 1,000 off this Charlie. That would be a one-off payment. "We're not going to go back next week for more. That's it. You just go and collect the money. Or, if you don't collect, you report back. If he says, 'I'm not going to give you any money,' you don't jump all over him there and then. You come back to the twins and you say, 'He's not going to pay.' Now that'll be the start of a different mission. You get 3 or 4 guys, and you go and sit on his house or the pub or club where he drinks, and you give him a talking to. You send him to hospital for a couple of days, and then you talk to him again." This was the everyday work of the firm. Most of the people who've written and spoken about the firm discuss the 3 known murders: Cornell, Jack the Hat and Mitchell, but the firm's main work was hustling day to day, night after night. Usually there was a big agenda to get through at the 9 o'clock meets, who had heard what, who'd done this, but if it was a thin day, and there was nothing on, then the twins would have a bet between themselves. "All right," Reggie would say, "we'll go out, me and Albert, and so will Ronnie and Ian, and I bet you a tenner we get more dough than you." "Right, okay." And off we'd go, and we'd blag whoever we could think of. Then we'd come back and compare what kind of money we'd come up with. It was easy to pick up £1,000, that was normal. We'd be blagging off people like budding promoters, crooked bookmakers, geezers who had spiels, people who had clubs. You always got the money under the guise of a loan that was going to come back later, guaranteed, we'd say, but they would never see it again, and in their hearts they knew it. Soon it became clear to me that the twins operated within a series of circles, each trusted with a different degree of confidence. The regular inner crowd would meet at 9, but anyone else would be invited in only to discuss the specific business the twins had in mind for them. After the meeting, most people would drift away. There might be just 1 or 2 of us left, and that's when you would get some nitty-gritty. The twins would say, "We don't trust this one," or "Keep an eye on so-and-so." They'd tell us who to pay, who not to pay, who was in at the time, who was in favor and who was out and in deep trouble with the brothers Kray. Fairly early on I realized they would discuss certain things with me that they wouldn't discuss with others. This may not prove I was a special confidant, it was partly divide and rule, but certainly Reggie did a lot of his confidential business with only me present. I was always with him, alone, when he went on his business meets. I looked the part, big, fit and menacing, but I was always far more than a bodyguard. It's clear that the twins instantly felt able to trust me with big sums of money. Within days of joining the firm, I was their main collector of protection payoffs, not just in the East End but in the rich pastures of the West End too. One Friday early in 1965, Ronnie Kray and Big Tommy Brown, Brownie the Bear, took me on a taxi tour of the West End. We went to all the different clubs where the twins were getting paid off, and in each place I was introduced to the characters who did the paying. First he introduced me to Franny Daniels at the Mount Club in Mount Street, a good upper-class spieler. Ronnie told Franny, "This is Albert. He'll be coming round to see you from now on." He memorized my face, and every Friday after I used to go up west alone at dinner time or lunchtime, as they called it in these places, and see a woman called Bet. Funny how things stick in your mind. I remember she had a poodle dog. She'd give me an envelope with £40 in it. Then Ronnie introduced me to Joe Daigle, Pauline Wallace's partner at the New Casanova. He told Joe I was now the collector. After that I called on Joe every Friday to pick up £50. The exchanges weren't menacing. There was no money counted out. I just collect the envelope, nobody begrudging it because this was already a recognized routine. All I did was take over the existing round. Joe Daigle was a white-haired man in his 60s. He had a little flat at the top of the club. I'd go up there, have a coffee with him, he'd be having his toast and marmalade, reading the Sporting Life. We'd discuss the weather, and there's the envelope, just like that. When we'd finished talking, I'd say, "Right, see you later," back next week and I'd be off to collect from another place. Maybe the Grosvenor. I never made any threats. I just picked up the money. Any heavy business had been done well before I arrived on the scene, but even then it would not have involved direct violence. You never threatened people or smashed the place up. You'd say, look, you're opening the gaff, and we're looking after it. So where do we come in? Then the club owner would offer, say, £50, and there'd be a bit of haggling until an agreement was struck. In a lot of cases, club owners would have come to a 9 o'clock meet to ask the twins to look after the places, so there had always been prior negotiation before I turned up for the envelope. Making all these collections became my regular Friday job. We used to call it the milk round. I would get up, skip the 9 o'clock meet and get to the West End, often by public transport. First I'd do one casino, where I would go upstairs, drink a cup of coffee with the old boy there and have a friendly chat. There was no threatening behavior, none of that business. I would just collect an envelope from him, then pop on to the Mount Club. I'd do 2 or 3 other places, then it would be back down the East End, to do all the little pissholes as I called the gambling clubs under the twins' protection. From each spieler I'd collect 10s or 20s. I used to go to the Little Dragon, up an alleyway off Whitechapel Road, to collect a tenner from Dutchy Sam. Then I'd go to Dodger's. His real name was Silvers, and he owned the 20th Century Club in Brick Lane on the corner of Fashion Street. Either Dodger or his runner Boris would give me £15. Then I'd go to Benny the cab driver's. His club was above a women's dress shop, pretentiously called a costumier, in Commercial Road. Benny gave me just £15. This was a good deal for him, because most of his patrons were his old mates from his days as a black taxi driver. These guys were compulsive gamblers who would do a few hours work, lose all their takings playing kaluki, then they'd go out and drive for a few more hours, and come back and gamble it all away again. I would always do the milk round on my own. In his book, Tony Lambriana says he accompanied me on a round and watched me pick up 40 envelopes. I would have looked like a bloody postman with 40 envelopes in my pocket, but that never happened. I never took anyone with me, certainly not Lambriana. The idea of one man doing it was so that you didn't expose the twins' business. If I'd have taken anyone on the milk round, we'd have shown out. When I had to go to the West End, either I went by public transport or I took a separate cab to each location. I couldn't even take one of our own drivers along because they would learn my rounds. Then they could inform on me and the twins, either to other criminal gangs or to the police. That was a risk we just couldn't take. None of the people who were paying us would go to the police themselves, partly because we were giving them a genuine service. If they hadn't paid us, so we would be on call with instant muscle. If ever they had trouble, they would surely have had trouble from some other mob. The mere fact that they could spread the word that we were protecting them was enough to frighten off every other mob in town. I know this because sometimes people would come directly to me to get other people who were demanding money off their backs. I would tell a victim to tell each troublemaker, Albert says, if you don't behave yourself, then I'm to pop round and see him. This way there was no threat of violence, yet the troublemaker knows he must lay off the guy. But now this victim is indebted to me for the service I've performed, so he's got to come up with money for me instead. He knew he would have to do this, that was understood right from the start, only his doing it willingly. Such a man would now become my private business, nothing to do with the twins. We never touched totally straight pubs or bookmakers because publicans and bookies have to hold a license, so they're usually pretty clean. If you go into them for dough, all they've got to do is to call the police. You've got no chance. When we did have an arrangement with a bookmaker, it was a side deal, away from his shop, for something the twins had done in the past. We only collected off crooked people, or off people who were dealing with crooks. That left us with plenty of opportunities, because right through the 1960s there were dozens of pubs and bookies all over London with clean licensees as front men, but where the true owners were convicted villains. These people fully understood the language the Krays were speaking. Today the sums I was collecting may not sound large, and they weren't colossal even then, but a tenner in the 1960s would be worth, say, £150 today. So as my total weekly collection was around £200, it's as if today I'm walking round with £3,000 cash in my pocket every Friday. Being trusted to hold that amount of cash soon led to the twins giving me the job of handing out the wages to the rest of the firm. I would bring all the money back to Ronnie, and he would say, "Right, give so-and-so 15 quid, give so-and-so a tenner, give so-and-so a score." That was the wages, the pensions. Nobody else got anything, only those individuals the twins told me to pay. There weren't many of us on the payroll. Myself, Ronnie Hart, Ian Barry, Scotch Jack Dixon, a stocky torpedo called Cornelius Connie Whitehead, and Ronnie Bender sometimes. We were the pensioners. If somebody else did anything requiring payment or expenses, they dealt with Ronnie or Reggie direct. Tony Lambriana would only get paid occasionally, if, say, he was sent up west on a job. He was not on a pension because he was not on the firm. I know, I paid out the wages. My own pension was £25 a week, but Reggie would give me 10% of any other business we put together, so that would bring me in another £50. So I was picking up £75 a week in all from the firm in those days. That's around £1,200 today, tax-free of course. All this only a year after coming out of jail. And the figure doesn't include various private deals I was building up on the side. On the firm, nobody trusted anybody, but I was the person the twins trusted most. I could be relied on both to collect the money and to steer clear of betting shops where others might lose it all. I wouldn't play a game of cards with it. I would do whatever job the money was for, and the twins got everything that was left. Another good reason for making me the firm's paymaster was because I could count. There were some real thick sods among us who just couldn't add up. Some had more severe disabilities. Once Ronnie Kray bought a Christmas tree and a set of fairy lights, and I watched as Ronnie Bender tried to set up the light circuit. It was so simple, basic school science stuff, but he couldn't manage it. I thought he was going to electrocute himself. The twins would try each person on various jobs. Then if they wanted someone to perform a particular task, they'd say, "Oh, Albert's capable of doing it." I did anything I was asked to do, so they came to rely on me. On that basis, I got a lot of additional work. They would loan me out, on contract you might say, to friends or allies who were a bit short-handed or who genuinely needed protection. One such man was my old bookmaking boss, George Mizell, under whose board I had worked, years before, at the Points. He had a 24-hour spieler called the Green Dragon, in the same alleyway as the Little Dragon, off Whitechapel Road. Now, when I was having time off from the firm, I used to go there privately to play cards and relax. One night I was in there with Georgie and his wife, a real Jewish mama who also liked a good game, when in came this guy, effing and blinding. He was a docker, a Saturday night drunk, who'd come straight out of a pub into the Dragon. So I said to him, "Listen, we're having a quiet game of cards. Stop swearing. There's a lady present." Everybody laughed at this, but it pleased Mama Mizell and Georgie too. It didn't please the docker who kept on swearing, so I wound up throwing him out. Georgie was so pleased with this that he asked Ronnie for regular protection. After that I was sent to the Dragon to collect £40 a week, a call that I added to the milk round. Then one day in 1965, Ronnie called me up and said, "Mizell's had a bit more trouble up the Dragon, and he wants to know, can he have you working there?" That suited me fine because I was going to get another £25 wages on top of my other earnings. And the twins didn't mind because I was still collecting £40 from the house every week for them. The job at the Green Dragon, where I was part doorman and part storeman, led to me looking after another spieler, the Silver Spinner in Stoke Newington, Harry Cashman's place. He was known as Boot Cashman because he had a boot-shaped nose that had been broken a few times. The spinner opened early in 1965, and the twins had a piece of it right from the start. I was there at the opening when there was a row between Jack the Hat McVitie and a Greek. The Greek pulled out a gun, and Jack pulled out a knife. I jumped on Jack's back and pushed him away and took the knife off him. Then I faced the Greek who was still waving his gun about. I realized the guy was trapped. All he wanted to do was get round the room to the door. These people in the club were all fussed, so I said to them, "Just back off, leave it," and I went towards him as he sidled his way round. I could see he didn't want to shoot anyone, he just wanted to get away. So I got him outside and let him go. I didn't even try to disarm him. But when I walked back inside, these people thought I had done a very heroic thing, a Gary Cooper, facing the Greek down in a high noon job. After this, boot cashman asked the twins if I could work there on a regular basis. I became the spinner's houseman and doorman in return for another £20 a week, but again the twins were copping on the side. There were some Americans who rented part of the spinner to run blackjack games. They also had tables at the Starlight, a spieler in Stratford Place off Oxford Street. One night these Yanks were held up there by a little firm who lined up the dice and blackjack croupiers and forced them to remove their trousers, then walked off with about £400. I was at the spinner that night when the Yanks ran back and told us they needed somebody to protect the place, so they wanted me there, all because I'd faced down this Greek with a shooter. The Yanks had to come to a deal with boot cashman, who agreed to have me transferred to the Starlight as security officer. My wages went up to £25 a week, for which I worked several overnights a week. I'd dish out the cards, collect the house tax money and explain the rules to newcomers, but there were a lot of bits and pieces on top. Whenever I sorted out any trouble, the croupiers would give me gambling chips. Winning punters would give me good tips. Even the Ladbroke Grove tearaways, whom I would have to deprive of their axes and bayonets as they came in, would tip me as I handed the items back on their way out. From all these sources I would pick up an extra tenner every night, £150 at today's prices. I think the twins had a third share in the Starlight, and they also took a protection payoff of £40 or £50 a week, which I think Billy Exley used to collect. After the stick-up, the Yanks never recovered their confidence, so they left town. For a while the tables were taken by Mickey Regan, the business partner of Ronnie Knight, Barbara Windsor's husband, but eventually the Starlight closed down. These clubs used to come and go, but there were always some in business, and any time a shooter was mentioned, I was called in because people thought I could handle armed robbers. In a way I could, because I knew their psychology. I could tell what was running through their minds because I'd been there myself. It takes one to know one. Not every protection payoff was collected by me and Billy Exley. Other people used to do specialist runs, and some clients paid their dues directly to the Kray family. When an associate of the firm, Fat Wally Garelick, opened up a cab business, he paid the twins a score, £20 a week. He would deliver the money to their Aunt May, who lived at 176 Valence Road, right next door to the Kray household. She knew nothing. As far as she was concerned, it was just an envelope for her lovely nephews Ronnie and Reggie. If only the entire operation had been as cozy a family business as that arrangement makes it sound. Instead, Ronnie's idea of family was plotting to use his own mother's caravan to kill poor Fat Wally. Despite joining the firm with my eyes wide open, knowing only too painfully about Lenny's branding and my own shooting, I had seen nothing yet. Getting as much money as I now was every week, but without running any of the risks involved in armed robbery, had a lot to recommend it. Of course, the twins had realized this years before I did. They seem always to have understood that crime doesn't pay, but for them that only ruled out straight crime, good honest-to-God thieving, which certainly is a mug's game. Far better to let other people risk going to jail. Then if they're lucky, and they get away with a big wad, that's the moment you steam in and levy your underworld tax on them. Looking back, I wondered why I didn't get into this game sooner. Ronnie and Reggie Kray never did any skilled theft, burglary, or robbery themselves. They would never go on an organized blagging. They said that was strictly for jailbirds, but as soon as they heard someone else had had it off, their first concern was, did they know anyone on the team? If they did, then they would go in for their share, their whack. They were just parasites, thieves' ponces. We'd wait for someone to have a blag off, and, if we knew someone on the team, we'd go after them for our corner. That's how we operated day to day. We'd find out who's just had a tickle and go in. It's a despicable form of crime, nothing to be proud of, but we didn't even pretend to have pride in our craft. We weren't top-notch master criminals. We were just bloody thugs, simple as that. Leeches. Look what we did with a bunch of brothers. A second-generation Irish family called the Barrys, no relation incidentally to my stepfather. Two of them ran a club in Stoke Newington, the Regency, which the Krays once had a share in, but which we still used as kind of a clubhouse, especially the downstairs after-hours drinker. We heard one day that some of the Barrys had got involved in dodgy fivers. They were supposed to have a printing press set up and were running off counterfeit £5 notes, which were pretty good, so we said we wanted a joey off them, a parcel. Like good little boys, they sent us a parcel containing £10,000, but there was a problem with them. As the first ones came off the press, the ink was heavy, which was okay, but as the print run continued, the ink became too light, which meant the later forgeries weren't any good. Because of this, the twins weren't happy with their parcel. They wanted a parcel that only had good ones. So we just went round and took a couple more parcels off them. We didn't buy them from the Barrys. We just demanded them, because we knew the business, and they knew they couldn't refuse. Who could they complain to? If we went to a team with the intention of profiting from their hard graft, we wouldn't necessarily tell them we knew they had had it off yesterday. We might say, "The word is that you've been a bit active lately." Then we'd say, "The other two need a bit of dough, and they've asked us to pop round and see you 'cause they done you a few favors in the past." We didn't say the twins. Calling them the other two was enough. The other two need a bit of dough, and they want a monkey, or they want £1,000. No one I went to see for the Kray firm ever rebuffed me, because, as Don Corleone used to say, I was making them an offer they couldn't refuse. Not even the old Chainsaw Gang, who were supposed to be the top flyers at the game. Their leader, Big Splinter Woodruff, had put up a bit of resistance one night and come to grief. The incident happened, like so much else in this saga, in the Regency, where my colleague on the firm, Scotch Jack Dixon, came up to me one night and complained, "This bloke Woodruff is getting on my tits." So I said to Jack, "Well, do him." He said, "Leave off Albert. He's 17 stone, and he keeps having a prod at me." Scotch Jack couldn't fight to save his life, but he used to whip people up into doing his fighting for him. This evening I decided I'd help out. I was with a girl at the time, so when Woodruff went to the toilet, I timed my attack. On his return, he had to walk 20 feet to get to the bar, so I got hold of the girl and pretended to dance with her, just to get moving. She didn't know what was happening. I spun her this way, then that way, as though I was in mid-dance, and when I knew where he was, I spun round on him and wham! I hit him on the chin, and he went down. Then he rocked on his shoulders and started getting up. I thought, oh no, because I knew I'd hit him good. So I went back over, gave him another one, and he went down again. Then everybody seemed to steam into him, hitting him with bottles, until Parky Barry, who was both a counterfeiter and a robber, dragged him into a storeroom, then took him away. I had broken his jaw. The next time we should have met, we missed him. Apparently, he was going down Whitechapel Road in a cab when he saw me and Reggie Kray walking along. Suddenly he dived on the floor saying, "They'll kill me, don't let them see me." Now, you can imagine what the rest of his team thought of all this. He's supposed to be a big bandido, and there he is, groveling on the floor. Our information had come through a middleman acting for the Chainsaw Gang who wanted to know why their esteemed leader had suffered the belting that gave him a wired-up jaw. The fellow also wanted to know whether this was the first strike in a Kray Gang war. Was this going to carry on? I said, no, but now I knew the way Woodruff was behaving, I decided we should take some money off him. So I continued, apart from the fact that his ruined Parky Barry's suit and my suit too. Tell him to give me a 50 and that's the end of it. So a few days later, we had a meet in another of our pubs, the Carpenter's Arms in Cheshire Street. In came our middleman with a guy from the Chainsaw Gang itself. He asked, "Is this a one-off or a regular bite?" "No," I said, "just expenses. Not a blag." So we got the 50, we had a drink with the guy, and he tailed it back to Woodruff. That encounter in the Regency, and especially the news that it had blown his nerve, destroyed his gangland status forever. But we only got that news because the twins had a spy, in the shape of the middleman. It's not much of an exaggeration to say the Krays had 1,000 spies. Certainly, hundreds had been carefully cultivated over many years by means of the twins' activities on behalf of the same jailbirds they had such contempt for the Aways. In the name of the brothers Kray, the entire East End criminal fraternity would be drafted into fundraising for the Aways. Any reluctance displayed by these donors wasn't caused by a lack of sympathy for their less fortunate comrades. It was down to their irritation that any gratitude would flow in the direction of the other two and nobody else. Of course, I'd run into Away's collections years before, at those Ponterpoints, but I don't believe any of the money collected by the Brown twins ever reached any jailbirds or their families. All money raised by the Krays would certainly have reached the right people because it served the twins' interests that it should. The Away's fundraising was conducted once a fortnight, according to a complicated ritual. We drank in quite a few pubs, and we gave each pub its own number. This was because the twins were convinced that all the phones they used were tapped. I don't suppose they were far wrong. Anyway, if I was out somewhere and I phoned the twins, I might say, "Everything's all right. Where shall I see you tonight?" Then Ronnie or Reggie would say, "Number 4, right." Now number 4 might be the Merry Widows in Bethnal Green, or it might be the Grave Maurice in Whitechapel. And in the evening you would go to that pub and either hand over that day's money or report on whatever you had found out. Once that business was done, people would be sent out to other pubs to gather up the rest of the clan. That was because the twins had already arranged meets with other people at some totally different pub. They'd have said, "Go to the Red Crown, and we'll see you there at 8 o'clock. But now somebody else would have to go there at 8 and say, "Listen, the other two are round at the Merry Widows," or wherever, and they'd take them there. If you think this is unnecessarily complicated, you must always remember that the twins were paranoid people who had every reason to believe the police had almost as many spies as they did. So as the chosen place was filling up, and it might look promising if there were a few obviously rich guys there, the twins would wink at you and say, "Do the Aways list." So now you would go round with a piece of paper and say, "We're collecting for the Aways," and we'd get whatever we could get. Then some guy would say, "Well, who's away?" We'd say, "Harry's doing too, and then there's his missus, and he's got 2 kids. All right, here's 25 quid. Send that round to them." And on we'd go to the next guy, until we'd bagged up a pretty good sum, only part coming from the twins themselves. But the twins would get all the credit, because when we went round to see the man's wife, we'd say, "The brothers sent you round this, to help out with the electric or the gas." And the woman would say, "Oh, aren't they lovely boys?" You still hear that today, lovely boys, but they were getting the glory for money that they had just nicked off other people. When you were doing this apparent act of kindness, you had to handle yourself carefully, in case the jailbird read things the wrong way. That's why we always went in pairs to an Aways house, because, you can imagine, the guy is sitting in the nick while someone's going to his house, dealing with his wife and handing her money. That's why we had to be two-handed. I can think of only one occasion when somebody said, "Sod it," in effect, to the Aways. It was Lenny Hamilton, the man who'd been poked by Ronnie and whom I'd stuck up for, only to get shot by Reggie. Well, the next time I saw Hamilton after my shooting, he came in the pub when I was doing the Aways list, and he tried to give me just a $5. So I said, "You're not getting away with that, you little rat. I want some more." I managed to get 25 quid out of him, which upset him because he couldn't buy a drink after that. I just wanted to get my own back. It was revenge for me, but I can understand why he didn't want to give generously to a Kray fundraiser. People rarely had to be forced to hand over a decent sum. This Hamilton incident was exceptional, because it would have been dangerous for anyone to spurn a collection for the Aways. The news that you hadn't forked out would rapidly be reported to Ronnie and Reggie, who wouldn't like to hear it. The bigger point is that when the Aways came home, they were beholden to the Krays. As soon as they came out of prison, they were expected to go and see the twins to say thank you. Then they'd get a few instructions. But sometimes guys didn't do this, and then there'd be trouble. You'd get a report that Pete is out. Maybe he's been out a week. Then Ronnie might say, "And he ain't been to see us yet, bastard. We sent him round some money. Now they're after getting the needle with him." So, somebody would see Pete and say, "Listen, you'd better get round and see the other two, 'cause they're getting a little bit shirty." But Pete may have screwed up his courage and resolved not to see them for all sorts of reasons. He might not have liked the idea of their henchmen coming to his home and handing unsolicited cash to his wife while he was locked up. Or he might have had a row with her because she's banned him from seeing them. "I don't want you to go round there. I took the money because we needed it, but I still don't want you to go." He himself may resent the idea of groveling to them in grateful homage. He might fear he could get involved in the scene again and wind up getting nicked, so he just wants to keep a low profile. Anything like this would have to be explained to Ronnie because he couldn't understand why anyone would want to go straight. But in the end, Pete would have to come in to clear the air, to explain directly to the twins why he hadn't come earlier. There must also have been times when wives didn't even tell their husbands the Krays had given any money. Not all the Away's money came from fundraising nights. Under the twins' instructions, I'd often pay out from what I had collected on the milk round. Go over and see Freddie's wife. He's in the nick, one of the Aways. I think she's in a bit of trouble. Someone's rung up and says she can't pay her electric bill, so I might give her a $5 or a $10, then the twins would get whatever was left from the round. I'd have to account for the rest. I'd tell them, she got a $10, he got a $5, this one got a score, and this is what's left. I had to keep a note of it all, so the twins didn't think I was tucking a lot, pocketing a slice of the action. I never had to do that because I had enough action that was entirely mine. If you were known to be on the firm, there was a lot of money to be picked up on the side. I had a lot of separate earners. This was my private enterprise. It was nothing to do with the twins. I was still freelance in that sense, but, obviously, the fact that I was known to be on the Kray firm gave me a leg up in getting all this outside business. The twins didn't quarrel with that. They knew you couldn't exist on what they were paying you. Let's say you went out, and you nicked say £1,000 from people on behalf of the twins. All you got out of it was 25 quid. You only got expenses, drinking, beer vouchers. Other people say I was getting £100 a week with the twins, but that would only have been if we'd had an exceptional hit. If the twins knew somebody on the firm was getting a regular £100 a week off them, they would have gone potty. They were getting scarcely £100 each themselves. But I could certainly pick up a lot more than £100 with all my own private nips added in. For instance, while I was minding the Starlight, I always needed a cab to get there. It was up in the West End, off Oxford Street, and it didn't open till 11 o'clock at night. So I'm waiting for a cab one night, and the manager of the cab firm says, "Could we have a talk? We're in a bit of trouble." I said, "We'll leave it till later, yeah? I got to go to work. I'll see you down the Regency when I get back." So I get back there about 3 in the morning. By this time I've had a few drinks, and he says, "We're getting a bit of trouble with scrub calls. People are phoning for cabs, but when they get to the address there's nobody there, so it's a waste of time." Also, in those days there weren't any radio cabs. The drivers had to carry a pile of sixpences with them and call back on the phone, so getting a scrub call was a big aggravation. So I said, "Well, why don't you stop it?" He said, "Well, how?" So I said, "Well, I ain't going to do it for a pension. Bring me in on the firm." So he said, "All right." I said 60-40. He said, "Okay." And for a joke I continued, "My way." And to my surprise, he said yes. So suddenly I've got 60% of the advance cab company. But now I've got to solve the problem. I just looked at the map, and I tried to work out, who can affect him? Where will his competitors be located? He was in Bow Road, so I looked at the map and thought, Mile End Stepney, going towards Hackney, Victoria Park, that way, Poplar that way, Stratford. Then I picked out all the cab firms and phoned them. I said, "Listen," and I introduced myself. "I've heard that some of your drivers is sending us scrub calls. Now if this don't stop, I'm going to come round your gaff and disconnect your wiring." So, it stopped. Straight away. Now up to that time my man had 5 owner-drivers, but from there we went up to 10 owner-drivers, and we were running a nice little business. So that's what he should have done from the start, only he didn't have any weight behind him to back it up. Sure, now he was giving me 60%, but his turnover was so much increased that he was probably getting twice as much money himself. I did myself a favor, but I saved his business. Look at it that way. Today, when they bring these big guys into big companies, management consultants, they do the same thing. They nick a bit, far more than we thugs ever did. So, business consultant I was, already. Another little earner was a fellow called Bosher. I never knew his real name, but he had a little scrapyard off Queensbridge Road in Bethnal Green. George Dixon, who had his own family firm based in Poplar, had been round threatening Bosher for money, so he'd come to the twins for help. Ronnie told him, "Albert will look after it," so my scheme was to phone George and tell him to leave Bosher alone. We weren't going to do this for nothing, so I went to see Boscher and made it sound more involved than it really was. I asked him for £100 down, and he dragged up £85. Then I told him, well, knowing George, he's not going to let it go with just one meet, so I'll have to keep a regular eye on the place. Boscher said, don't worry, I'll pay you every week. So I said, fair enough. That'll be a tenner, but he could only afford £5, so I would collect a tenner fortnightly. Silly money, but it all added up. And, anyway, I didn't have to do any more for it because it was all sorted in one little chat with George. I arranged a meet. We went through a jokey routine, rubbing each other down as if we were likely to be tooled up, and then I said, you're messing about with a very good friend of mine. And he said, well, in that case, I'll leave it out. It was done with a smile and a joke because we weren't enemies at all. We were all in the same game. George Dixon was a flash guy. When he came into a place, he was always shouting and hollering. He'd shout just for a drink, and if anybody so much as glanced at him it would be, who you looking at, sunshine? Once he went too far and said something that upset Ronnie Kray. The next time he was in the Regency, Ronnie stuck an automatic in his face and pulled the trigger, but the gun didn't fire. He pulled it again, and it still didn't work, so Ronnie gave up and presented George with the bullet. The colonel must have been in a pretty good mood to let him off that light. Our relationship with the Dixon gang had other ups and downs. Once the twins called me at 3 in the morning to go to the Regency where George's brother, Alan, was terrifying people. When I arrived, I told him to behave himself, and that he owed me a score for getting me out of bed, for my cab fares and for the aggravation. He said, Albert, I've only got a tenner on me, but if you come round the house in the morning you can get the other 10. I thought, no, it'll be an ambush, so I said, just give the tenner, and we'll call it a night. I think he believed he was playing with somebody new to the game. 3 years after the Krays went down, the Dixons found themselves playing against Commander Bert Wickstead, who accused them of trying to take over where the twins had been stopped. Alan got a 9-year jail sentence, George a 12. A lot of what we did was opportunistic. We'd see how far we could go and get away with it. I was astonished at what even other villains would put up with. Not everything took the form of a weekly payment, but there was something else we called the nip. This was used on pubs and clubs where we couldn't get a regular pension, so we would nip them about once a month by putting up some story to justify a special payment. If you were on the firm, you couldn't help getting to know the twins' mum and dad, Violet and Charlie, because the morning meets used to be held in the family home, 178, Valence Road, Bethnal Green, otherwise known as Fort Valence. It was a tiny, rented, terraced house, and there's no point in going on a tourist trip to see it nowadays because it's long been demolished. There were 3 rooms on the ground floor. The front room was used as the main office. That's where you said or did your bit before you were sent off, not necessarily out of the house, but usually to one of the other rooms where it would be tea and biscuits served all day, and you would do any other business that didn't need the twins being present. What's going on? She would have replied, with all honesty, well, my boys have got a crowd of their friends in, and they're sitting in the front room talking. What they're talking about, nobody knows. Half the time we didn't know, so I'm sure she knew nothing in any detail. She made sure she didn't know, but she probably had a good idea. In the Krays movie, Violet was portrayed as a very formidable woman, with a ferocious tongue. I must say I was never on the wrong end of her tongue, but then I was never with her when anybody ran her boys down. All that stuff took place when the twins were growing up and neighbors were reporting them to the police for any mischief. Then she might have ripped into any interfering busybodies, but I've never known an occasion when she did it in the 1960s. By then, if somebody was mouthing off about the twins and running them down, she wouldn't have had to lift a finger. One of us would have gone and sorted it. After that, there wouldn't be a peep out of the offender. Of course, she must have known the twins were at it in pretty spectacular ways. The record shows they were tearaways right from the start, but, thinking of my own start in life, that didn't make you an exception among East End kids, and it didn't make you socially unacceptable. On the contrary, in many households, it was a passport to social acceptability. Your antisocial behavior made you a welcome guest. This was the world turned upside down, so it took a lot of EastEnders a long time to realize that the twins weren't just extremely successful tearaways but dangerous psychopaths masquerading as traditional thugs. Their dad, old Charlie Kray, certainly knew there was a lot of heavy stuff going on. If somebody on the firm was involved in any violence, he was an expert in getting bloodstains out of clothes. You could just hand a suit or a coat to him, and he would clean it up by the next morning. There'd be no forensics left. But as long as he didn't ask, and nobody spelt it out to him, he could claim he knew nothing. It's like the Germans didn't know about concentration camps. Okay, you believe it if you like. Don't believe it if you don't like. It was easy to underestimate both twins because they were educationally subnormal in the extreme. They couldn't read, and they couldn't write, beyond a normal 6-year-old's ability. You know the kind of joke, I read a book once. It was a green one. In the case of the twins, that was literally true because they'd once been given a book, How Green Was My Valley, and for some reason, they'd both been forced to read it. So whenever anyone mentioned a book in our circles, I admit, this wasn't very often, that was the only one the twins could come up with. When people are bending over backwards to say nice things about the twins, they say, but they never gambled. That's true, but that was only because they couldn't understand betting odds. They could not count or calculate. Yes, they could count money like a fairground gypsy can, but no basic education had sunk into them at all. One time Reggie went to see Doc Blasker, the firm's tame GP, about a bit of an infection. He came back and asked us what was on the prescription. We read, urethritis, except of course that when we Cockneys spoke, it came out as euthritis. So Reggie said, "Is that anything to do with youths?" Mechanically, too, the twins were a complete catastrophe. Reggie was a terrible driver. He had a license, and now and again if they bought a nice new car he would want to drive it, until he hit something, and he usually did. Then would have to get one of the boys to drive it. Ronnie didn't drive at all. They were completely helpless without someone else to prop them up. They had just 3 things going for them: considerable physical strength, a ruthless capacity to direct it, and instinctive animal cunning. Oh, and they had one other thing: each other. They were like 2 hunting dogs. If there'd been only one, you could have whacked it out with no trouble, but the 2 of them together could come at you in any way at any time. A lethal combination. I don't think Violet Kray created the twins. It wasn't her fault that they turned out like they did. I often wonder how they evolved, what turned them into what they were. Ronnie once told me that he had a cousin 2 or 3 years older than they were. When they were 7 or so, this kid used to take them onto the bomb sites, which, after the Blitz, made marvelous play areas for children all over the East End. Boys, in particular, would make little dens and camps among the rubble. So this older cousin would get the twins into one of his dens and torture them. In the middle of one of these deserted sites, you could scream, shout, and cry for hours, and no one would hear you or come to your rescue. Did this torture have any effect on the twins? Well, I suppose it must have done. They never told their parents about it, but obviously it had to be stuck deep in Ronnie's memory for him to tell me about it. I don't know what happened to the cousin later on, probably something drastic, but I'm sure it wasn't Mrs. Kray who made these boys villains. It was just the way you grew up in them days. If you were a little bit handy with the fists, you got into the fight game, and from there you could go into protection or robbery. If you weren't any good at fighting, you'd go to work in a factory or on a building site. Anything, just to get your bread and butter. But the twins had something else in their makeup. They weren't just desperados, they were mad. I can't claim to know how Ronnie Kray came to be queer either, but he certainly was queer throughout the time I knew him. He didn't hide the fact that he was a homosexual. He liked the young boys, I mean young men, not children, and they were known as his prospects. There were a lot of scouts who used to go out hunting for good-looking, susceptible youths. They would come back and say, "Ronnie, I've got a terrific boy you've got to meet," and then this kid would be brought to the pub. Some of these kids would be fit young fighters, and I used to think, Christ, how can that lad get involved in this sort of stuff? But they did. It surprised me. Ronnie wasn't the only gangster I knew who preferred men to women. There's half a dozen villains I can name who were queer, and they weren't shy about letting anybody know about it. The twins understood that to get away with running a criminal enterprise in the middle of a moderately law-abiding community, you had to carry local opinion with you. The locals didn't have to approve of your rackets. Your average East Ender would normally turn a blind eye whatever you were up to, but if you wanted to win general goodwill and discourage straight folk from shopping you when police came snooping, you had to be seen doing good works in public. That's why the twins consciously created their charitable image. This started as a myth. They weren't charitable at all, and became a legend. The gullible, the religious, and the just plain dumb spread it around the East End as if it was not only true but also uplifting. The legend was this crude: people really did believe the Krays were good to dogs, old ladies and nuns. Well, you'd have to be some kind of psycho not to have some kindness in you, say, for an old girl down on her luck. Of course, you'd give her a fiver if you had it, or a couple of quid. But the twins were very conscious of their image, and they worked a lot on it, thanks to Leslie Payne, their main business schemer, who had impressed on them the public relations side of organized crime. And so they would hire a pub or club, or use one of their own premises, and they'd let it be known that they were organizing a charity night. A regular good cause was the Bancroft Hospital in Mile End. They would invite a ward sister and probably a matron from the maternity unit, as well as the mayor, the local priest and, most important, a few people off the local weekly paper, the East London Advertiser. Then they would go to a couple of local florists and ask them to make up one of those big floral display baskets. They'd do the same with the local fruiterer. Then they would hold these baskets up for auction, and they would start off the bidding at a tenner, £20, £25, and up. But what people didn't realize was that, instead of just the last bid being collected, all the smaller intermediate bids were also being extracted. Then when the proud winner was presented with his basket, one of us would be standing nearby and embarrassing him by shouting, "Offer it up," forcing him to put the basket back into the auction all over again, but still obliging him to pay over what he'd already bid to win. For this, the poor guy would get a clap. People would say, "What a wonderful chap he is," and then the prize item would go again, and all the proceeds would be collected up for some good cause. Often it would be the kiddies unit, a good one for tugging at the emotional heartstrings. Sure, it got some dough, but in next week's East London Advertiser, it was the twins who got the glory. An article would appear saying, "Local sporting gentleman donated a sizable sum of money to the maternity unit," complete with a big blazing photograph. To guarantee the story would get a decent spread, the twins would make sure a few well-known sporting names, like the boxer Terry Spinks, would turn up in all innocence to back the good cause. There were other ways we used to raise money for charity. We would visit local businesses like the florists, and somebody who half knew them would say, "Listen, the other two are doing a charity night and would you like to do us a flower arrangement?" The MC will say, "This arrangement is by Mary Jones, the florist shop, so you'll get a bit of advertising." And so the shop would produce the goods, but we never paid for them. We just got them to do it for us, with a smile. The net result was that the credit didn't go to dear Mary Jones. All she got out of it was the mention of her shop. In contrast, the Krays appeared to be very generous, which, I suppose, they were with other people's money. They also practiced their own brand of community policing. Sometimes people would come to the twins and say they'd been tucked up, or somebody had jumped all over them. If Ronnie or Reggie already knew the plaintiff, they would listen to find out who had done the foul deed. If they had a previous reason to dislike the offender, they were more likely to do something to him. Any action would now appear to be a favor to the guy who'd come for help, whereas they were just settling their own long-term feud. Only the guy would think they'd done him a favor, so he would now owe them a favor. But that was the exception. 9 times out of 10, all they'd do is tell a lieutenant like me, "This man's boy got a slap round the Regency, so tell the guy who did it to piss off." Otherwise, the Krays weren't in the business of settling other people's problems. For instance, if a girl claimed she'd been assaulted or raped by some tow rag, that wouldn't have troubled the twins at all. They would have thought, "She's probably an old slag anyway," and that would be the end of it. On the other hand, if they were trying to court the girl's father or brother, they might say, "Leave it to us, we'll sort it out." Then they might well say, "Right, We'll go give him a slap. Not many legitimate people ever asked such favors. The twins would think it must be a get-up if ever a straight person did come to Fort Valence and say, "Listen, could you help us out over so-and-so?" They'd say to themselves, "Who is this stranger?" And they'd go in the other room and keep asking all of us, "Who is he?" Then they'd send someone else in to talk to him because by now they were thinking there's some sort of wind-up here. Perhaps the police were behind this guy and trying to entrap them. The twins' paranoia about spies and infiltrators was partly a reflection of their own mass exploitation of spies and infiltrators into other gangs. Most of their own spies contributed information only occasionally, but there were several full-time professionals. One was called Joe Schaefer. He was just like someone out of Fiddler on the Roof, a typical old Jewish gentleman. He would creep around all the places frequented by other mobs. He knew everybody, and anything we needed to hear, he would tell us. Or you could send him on special trips, specific missions, have a look round so-and-so, or see what you can find out about this person. Then he'd go out and discover if this target was using a particular club or how the individual or group was moving around the West End. I could not stand spies like old Joe Schaefer, even though they were meant to be working for us. Those people were creepy, but they all had a use. The twins could get them to do anything for a $5. That pair had a talent for finding just the right bloke for any job, but they had no training for this. Nowadays you go to college to learn business management, even industrial espionage, but Ronnie and Reggie knew it instinctively, just as they knew how to terrorize people better than any terrorist. They knew how to question folk and how to kid them. It was just basic instinct, and you could see it working. You could see it unfold from one day to the next. You'd get an idea one day and discuss it with the twins. They'd go silent for a while, then they'd say, "Oh, yeah, get hold of so-and-so." They'd know exactly who to put into a scheme to make it work. And work it would.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.